So our first panel left us with an awful lot of questions, and so we have a second panel to solve all the problems. And at least in theory, we are going to look at how these things play out in practice, which we have Shannan Brown, who was 2011 Teacher of the Year, and teaching in 5th grade still, right, in San Juan, Sacramento.
I'm currently full release, serving as president of the Teachers Association.
I got you. Okay, but you are a fifth grade teacher.
Correct.
That's the best.
Forever.
Forever. And Matt Wayne is, I guess, fair to say, representing the administrative point of view, because you're an assistant superintendent.
Correct.
But you're also teaching here, or lecturing here as well. Yes. And then Susan Moore Johnson, who just retired from the Rossiter of the East, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and testified in the trial for the defense. Although I gather some of what you said was interpreted differently. And then Julie Koppich is an educational consultant and an expert in teacher evaluation with a strong view about how teachers should be evaluated that I'm sure she will share with us. I'm trusting she will share with us. So I started the first panel by just kind of polling the audience, polling you. Do you support the decision?
You're pointing your finger at me and
Yes,
asking me that question?
Do you support
No.
Vergara?
No.
We knew that. Do you support the decision?
Do
no,
I?
Matt.
Yeah. So I'm a management, so when I heard about the decision, I did a jig on my desk and then took out the list of teachers we want to get rid of. And no, I'm just kidding. It could have some benefits, but overall not supportive.
But you do not support it generally, yeah. And just to get you on the record.
Yeah, I'm on the record. I was also actually a witness in the Vergara case as well, and I do not support it.
Were you surprised by the decision?
I think the comment was shared earlier that the attorneys that were on the defense had indicated that this was likely going to be the outcome based on how the conversation and some of the judge's comments and the way witnesses were treated differently for the defense versus the plaintiffs, that they were not surprised and everyone should be prepared for this outcome.
Treated differently by the judge? What was your experience?
I was treated very respectfully. He was pleasant, quite thrilled, and had everyone congratulate me on being a California Teacher of the Year, actually. So I don't think my experience was typical.
Let's ask Susan about.
Well, I think I read all the testimony actually, but I didn't watch all the deliberations, and I think that's when you started to get a sense that certain testimony was allowed and others comments were disallowed, and I felt more stunned by the process itself and the notion that any decisions would be made based on these bits of information that everyone battled over. So it was more, for me, just such a strange set of processes to reach important decisions with.
Were you surprised when you saw the decision?
No, I like others, heard it's going to go that way. And I was actually more surprised to read the decision, to see so little connection between the finding and the evidence. I think actually I'm very curious what happens at the appellate level, not so much what the end result will be, but even how the process works, because I feel so naive about it. But it seems to me that if anyone actually reads the testimony, it will be very hard to say that that line is clearly drawn between these laws being unconstitutional and the evidence that was presented, including the value-add evidence, which really has virtually nothing to do with the practices that were being proposed there.
What was your reaction?
I was a little surprised and very disappointed. I didn't follow all the testimony, but I did read the decision as soon as it came out. And what surprised me is that the evidence that was there and the evidence that was left out, number one. Number two, that I thought that the decision itself oversimplified some very complex issues. And third, I was fearful that that decision would suck all of the air out of the policy conversations and narrow those conversations to these few issues that don't begin to get at how do we make schools better for kids.
I think that's a really important point, just because we all sat there and listened to the other panel. Whether this, in fact, is opening this rich conversation about important issues, or whether, as these cases go to other states that are, they're, mockeries of what happened here, we are just talking about, should all teachers be denied tenure? I mean, it's nowhere else except California are people talking about 2 or 3 years. I mean, that's what the testimony was about, not should there be any tenure, should there be any due process. But when that decision was reported nationally, and as it's playing out in New York and in other areas where it's being discussed, is tenure over for teachers? Should teachers have no job protections? And that then doesn't get at the kind of rich discussion that we might hope for.
Oh, so you're saying it's had the worst possible effect?
I think so. I think so. I don't think it's been data-based, information-informed, any of it.
But you talk about, there's only one copycat lawsuit that I know of.
Oh, but there's much conversation about it. Yeah, yeah. But New York, I mean, that'll be heard around the world.
Yeah. So but can you both were testifying for the defense. How do you defend last in, first out? How do you defend tenure after less than 2 years?
So first, the issue was not tenure after 2 years. It was tenure.
Yeah.
It's the law is unconstitutional and then gets interpreted that way.
But
2
the
years.
judge's decision talks about the absurdity of being forced to make a decision during a teacher's second year. The judge doesn't say there shouldn't be tenure. The decision doesn't say that. The judge says this statute is unworkable.
Right. But I guess what I want to say is that's what's happening in California. It's about 2 or 3 years. It's about the particular law. But it is being read nationally as a statement about tenure for teachers or due process for teachers.
And Bill mentioned Wisconsin and Texas. So you see this as a piece of something that's going on?
I think it's generated a great deal of conversation about who teachers are, what teaching as a career ought to be. And I don't think it's great for the profession. I think it's really problematic. But defending LIFO, for example, I mean, I think you had this conversation in the last panel, and I won't repeat it, but layoffs are not meant to be ways of dismissing teachers. It's a huge number of teachers in California because you have such funding problems, and the layoffs are so many. But layoffs are really meant to be short-term adjustments to changes in the economy or the demand. They aren't meant to make final job decisions about individuals, which is kind of the idea that is behind the use of LIFO decision, of non-LIFO decisions. I mean, the general evidence is that experience matters. The evidence from economists Sonny Ladd, John Pepe, and Matt Kraft, there are several very, very solid studies, and I'm not an economist, but they are, that says if you look overall, if you control for demographics, in fact, experience matters, and teachers do, in fact, get better up through at least 10 or 11 years. Not 5, not that plateau we all talk about, but continue to get better. So if you're trying to find a general rule, not what will the effect be on this particular school, it makes sense.
So I'd like to jump in on this, and this theme came up in the first panel, that we're asking all the wrong questions. So to me, one of the most damaging things that the entire Vergara lawsuit did was take up everyone's cognitive and emotional space talking about something that is not going to improve the profession, and it's not going to improve instruction for students. The evaluation systems in California, I talked to other teachers and leaders throughout the state, in addition to the fact that we did our own survey in our own district, teachers and administrators said our evaluation system was worthless. It didn't do anything to improve practice. Nobody valued it. But for some reason, we all kept just doing it. And the Vergara case, in my opinion, takes us down this road of, well, how do we just keep this system and just fine-tune all of these details around the edges? And that is not going to get us to the transformational work that we all believe in needs to happen.
So what you're saying, you're indicting your own profession. It seems to me what you're saying is that you all knew this didn't work, and yet you just tinkered at the margins, and you let someone else define it.
I appreciate you allowing me to clarify that, because it's not at all what I was saying. Before the Vergara case even occurred, I can speak to my own local context. We had already begun the conversation, and it was actually the Teachers Association that put on that we wanted to talk about evaluation, because we said this is worthless. And a comment from the earlier panel, how much time actually gets allocated to this? There's some initial conversation, depending on your administrator. They may pop in once, and then there's some signing off at the end of the year. If this is really about improving our practice, then we want to completely redesign it. So we started that conversation before the Vergara case came.
Yeah.
This is not about
Being
changing
the teachers.
Yes,
Yeah.
This is not about changing the statutes. The current statutes already allow these conversations to occur, and we've already been doing that work. So we're already into it for 2 years now, before this even started. That teachers want meaningful feedback to improve their practice.
And I agree that our evaluation system hasn't been effective in looking at different reasons to evaluate, right? So in terms of evaluation to improve performance, right, many systems are not set up that way. As a principal, I had an opportunity to rate a teacher as unsatisfactory or satisfactory. No scale, no real opportunities to provide some differentiated assessment of their performance. But if we're looking at evaluation as a means to exit teachers from the profession, or from your school at least, that's where it's also problematic, because it's a process that takes such a long time, 2 years of evaluation plus 90 days, that makes it burdensome to do that. So I agree it's broken, but I'm saying on both ends I think it's an issue, because then you really can't, you're taking so long to be able to exit those who really aren't making that progress, and you're not putting in the time and energy to focus on those ones who need to make progress, and really, like you said, all teachers who want to be improving.
I want to ask Julie to talk about peer review and peer assisted, so on and so forth. I know you're a strong supporter of that as a way of identifying teachers who need help and counseling out teachers. Will you?
Yes, but I want to say something first,
Sure,
and then I'll get to peer review. And it's the notion that tenure happens after 18 months. A couple of years ago, I participated in a study of beginning teacher policies in California. And as part of that study, we went out and interviewed a bunch of beginning teachers. And then we looked at state databases for whatever they're worth, but they were as good as they were going to get at the time. And what we found is just about half of teachers earn tenure after 2 years. The reason for that is...
That's factually incorrect. 32 states...
California?
Oh, you're starting just counting California?
Just California.
Oh, sorry.
Just California. I don't know about other states.
Well, let me fill in the other states, because 9 states, it takes 4 or more years to get tenure. 32 states, it takes 3 years. California and 3 other states, it's 2 years. Mississippi, it's 1 year, and there are 4 states with no tenure at all.
But my point is 2 years is what the statute says, not what the reality is. The reality is, perhaps because we've had so many sequential years of teacher layoffs, that many teachers begin their careers often for a number of years as temporary teachers. So by the time they're hired as probationary, they have 3, 4, 5 years under their belt, sometimes in the same school, sometimes with the same principal. So, I mean, I think we have to be careful about the terms we use and how we describe what's going on. But in terms of peer review, I am a big fan of peer review, as is Susan.
There are 3 of us, I believe.
And Shannan, she has it in her district. So it's to put it very simply, and then my colleagues can correct me, it's a system whereby very skilled teachers who are jointly selected by a union and management panel based on a set of defined qualifications serve as both supporters of and evaluators of
beginning teachers.
Sometimes beginning teachers, that's problematic in California because of a quirk in our statute. Most often tenured teachers who are in trouble. But the theory is, and it works in practice other places that don't have California's quirky law, the theory is that teachers are, the principal says, oh, this person isn't doing very well, needs a little help. And so a mentor or often called a consulting teacher goes in, works with that person perhaps for a year, providing intensive support, and at the end doing the evaluation. And what we find across the country in places that have peer review, number one, the peer reviewers are much harder on colleagues than our principals. Number two, they are much better informed. Number three, they are much better trained. And number four, the outcomes of the system are better. Teachers get supported, most experience success. Those who aren't successful are out.
I've done some reporting on that in Toledo, which has had a peer-assisted review for a long time, but it's mostly with the beginning teachers. And it turns out that there's an equal number of teachers and administrators on the panel, and they do counsel out an awful lot of teachers, and it's actually pretty hard to tell who's who when they're discussing when they're discussing teachers, because they take it pretty seriously. But it hasn't caught on. It's got a track record of working, and yet it hasn't caught on.
Well, what do you mean by caught on?
Caught on. It didn't go to Cleveland.
Oh yeah, it is in Cleveland.
It didn't
actually
go to Wichita. You know, it did.
No, but it's in Cleveland. It's in Montgomery County.
Yeah.
It's not taken on as a storm, but it's not just in Toledo and San Juan.
Well, no, it certainly hasn't taken on a storm, because that program in Toledo is 20 years old now.
No, I understand, but there are more recent examples of programs that are thriving and outside of California for both beginning and tenured teachers.
Matt?
And I think, the challenge, and when you say it hasn't been taken on, right, I think that this goes back to the larger narrative of what are we investing our resources in, right? And this, to do PAR well, is a real investment of resources. And so, unfortunately, in my district, this happened before I got there, but when we were going through our budget cuts, PAR was eliminated because it was too expensive to have the teachers available, to have the administrators to do things like that. And so it can be something that's very beneficial, but if it's not going to be invested in, and we're deciding whether to have a PAR panel, or put books in classrooms, we're going to always choose to put the books in the classroom. And the challenge is we need to put, we need to make those decisions in the current funding climate that we're in.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I have discovered that many contracts in California do contain PAR language, or did until just recently contain PAR language, but that it's not funded. Which, if you think about it, this whole narrative around getting rid of bad teachers is fascinating, because we have a mechanism to support people who are struggling in our profession, to help them improve, and if they're unable and unwilling to improve to meet standards, then they are counseled out of the profession. So we have the mechanism. It's very respectful, it's highly effective, it's research-based, and there are many places that said, well, we can't afford it. When we're talking about quality instruction, and if, the comments made earlier, if the teacher is one of the most significant factors, and the quality of instruction is one of the most significant factors in education, then when we sit down to look at budgets, then the first priority should be, what are we doing to improve instruction? And if we have people struggling, if they're newer to the profession or veterans, that should be our priority, to make sure that everyone is receiving the support to be successful, and if they're unable or unwilling to improve to meet standards, they should exit. But PAR should be funded in every single district, because it is the way we support our colleagues when they're struggling, so they're not left alone, and students are not left alone with a struggling teacher. There is someone who is trained to help them improve their practice.
Can I also say that this idea that PAR is expensive is a very short-term view of the cost, that in fact it's a kind of cost-benefit analysis will suggest that having a process to dismiss, all you have to do is dismiss a veteran teacher without going to arbitration, and you've paid for your program. No, it's really quite amazing. Retaining new teachers with the support that the consulting teachers give means that you don't have this churn of turnover. So I think the problem is that, when the budget hearings come up, someone says, oh, this consulting teacher is going to cost $60,000. Well, we can't support that. And
Are you trying to suggest that we do short-sighted budgeting in education?
No, I would never, never.
I want to ask this question about the narrative, because a number of you keep talking about the narrative. And it seems to me that the people who are not in your camp have gotten to frame the narrative. And then I wonder whether this really is your fault, whether it's the profession's timidity. I mean, you're saying, well, we've known all along that the evaluation doesn't work, and the administrators know it sucks, and the teachers know it, but you haven't done anything about it. And so you've allowed this vacuum into which has stepped some well-financed, et cetera, et cetera. Will you accept that responsibility? Blame, let's call it?
For the profession?
So since it's my profession,
Yes.
here's what I'll say is, to a degree, I think there's a larger issue, which is, I believe Julia commented on this earlier, the situations we're dealing with are extremely complex. Yeah. So it takes a lot longer to tell the truth about what's going on. So we have been trying to tell the truth about what's going on in our very complicated way we do as teachers, because we want everyone to understand every detail of what's happening. When a much simpler narrative is offered, which is the reason you have achievement gaps is because you have bad teachers in failing schools, and that's it, anybody can follow that.
Right.
Well, when you try to talk about, as Linda Darling-Hammond did, all of the issues that students are facing now, increasing poverty, the working conditions in our schools, how everything was compounded during the recent budget cuts, it's a very complicated story to tell. So we need to do a better job in coming up with shorter talking points that still get to the truth around what we're trying to do in public education. So yes, we are partly to blame for taking so long to realize that we need to make sure that we can give our answers more succinctly about what we think.
So you're saying it's an image thing? It's a presentation. It's like
it's a framing issue. I agree, and we haven't done as well with the framing as we can, because when you bring up those issues that we're facing with, that we face with in real time in our schools, and see that often the accusation is, if you bring up that 60% of outside factors, is that you have low expectations. Right? And that if you just had high expectations, and look, there is that one school over there that has done it. So if you just had high expectations and that school did it, you could, and did what they did, you should be able to do it. And I found myself on the defensive of that sort of rhetoric. So I agree, we need better talking points that also, kind of frame the issue in a way that shows, I think, educators as what we are, champions for these causes, not ones working against these causes. But people have said, no, we're the champions, we're the reformers, right? Rather than you all who are in the profession.
The word reformer, in my view, has taken on a really negative connotation. It has now a specific meaning that it didn't used to have. It's sometimes called corporate reform, it's sometimes called marketplace reform. but it is a whole set of issues allegedly meant to change the status quo
Well,
that
they've taken over
essentially
the debate.
eliminates the teaching profession and often school administrators and frankly often school districts and superintendents from the conversation. And yes, the so-called reformers have done a better job of getting their message out, but they have a kind of perverse message if you care about public schools.
See, that's what I'm trying to push you on, is whether you're saying it's message, and I'm saying no, it's behavior. It's you have not done enough to raise the standards of your own profession.
Can't it be both?
Well, I'm sure it can, but I mean, you have the medical profession setting some standards. I was a high school teacher. I remember we had some teachers who were asleep on the job, but we didn't do anything about it. So maybe it's a lack of courage, a lack of leadership.
I think that now I'm going to.
You've dug this hole that you're in.
Let me insult any principal who's sitting in the room.
I was about to do that.
If it's a lack of courage in the situation you described, it's a lack of courage on administrators' part, school administrators, quite frankly. I mean, there are all sorts of policy conversations we could have about what the state has or hasn't done in the last 30 years. It hasn't changed the framework for teacher evaluation. There are districts like Shannan's and others, some in California, Poway and San Diego County, some in other states, that have grabbed the teacher evaluation issue by the horns in a productive way. They've developed systems based on support. The system we have now in most districts is pretty paltry. You talk to beginning teachers or experienced teachers, it's pitiful. It neither identifies the kind of help teachers need, nor does it give them opportunities to meet their own professional challenges, nor does it try to deal with those teachers who are really egregiously bad. And that's because, so I was a high school teacher too. I also was a union rep. I've had many careers. And one of the things that always frustrated me when I worked for the union was there'd be a teacher I knew was just terrible. District wanted to fire that person. We'd go to the personnel office with the file, and what was in the file on evaluation? This person's doing just fine.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember that from my end. I want to go back to what Susan said about Vergara sucking all the air out of the debate and focusing, and you all seem to agree. What's to be done? I mean, this is a bad place right now.
Right. I'm not sure what's to be done in California.
Let's talk nationally.
Right, nationally. I do think, that there's not a simple answer to that, but one piece is to actually deal with the evaluation issue in a serious way. I think in the trial, there was no disagreement that there were schools that were not serving low-income kids, minority kids, English language learners well. That was not in dispute. The question was, what's behind this? And the idea that eliminating the statutes or even modifying the statutes is actually going to change either the assessment or the support that teachers need, I think is a pipe dream.
Would it change the least experienced teachers ending up in the most economically disadvantaged?
This is where I come in about principals. Not unless there's a serious systematic effort district-wide, but also among administrators, many of whom are outstanding, let me just make that clear, to ensure that all schools are well managed, that the best principals are not assigned to the wealthiest districts, that the supplies are fairly distributed, that those schools are managed in a way that is fair to teachers, where they can count on getting good resources, where they can count on some level of order and norms that support good instruction. All of that is very much in the hands of a principal, and smart principals quickly know that they should share that with their best teachers.
Has Vergara, you guys are both practitioners, I mean, what's been the impact of Vergara on your school or in your district? Do you talk about it? Are you behaving differently? Are you wishing you hadn't gone into teaching?
So I just want to kind of add a couple of pieces. That my teaching experience for 12 years, I was in a Title I school that was labeled failing. And the idea that we have failing teachers and failing schools is mythology. Do we have some bad teachers that happen to teach in failing schools? Probably. Statistically speaking, probably. But I do take it very personally because I was in a Title I school and I was constantly working to support my students in whatever way I could. So I think that just that assumption needs to be challenged. But to your question around what are we doing is we have a very collaborative relationship with the district. And we did not wait for the Vergara case to do this, but I will say it's added some urgency around our work. That we feel that we should be leading the conversation and putting forward, as Julia commented on, what evaluation system. We're not even calling it that anymore. We're developing a system of professional growth. Because if we truly want transformation in public education, then we want everyone to be in a growth cycle. This idea of meeting minimum competency is enough, needs to be gotten rid of. So what we're doing is we are realizing that we need to blaze the trail before someone lays the trail on us and says this is your new reality. So we have, what it's done is it's impacted the urgency of our work because we know as educational professionals, and I'll say union and district leaders, that this is our profession and we know more about it than policymakers. So we better get on the work before they try to figure it out for us.
Are you doing it in time? Is it too late?
It's too late.
I don't think it's too late.
But I think
But are you on the defensive because of Vergara?
When you get down to the details of the Vergara case, you either for it or you're defending, right? So that when you reduce it down to those components, but as far as leading the work around what should be happening in our schools, I think we are leading, which is appropriate for us as educators to be doing, and that ties back into your comment earlier of what did we do? And I think, again, it goes back to the first panel, that teachers went into the profession because they want to teach, and they don't want to get into politics, and they don't want to be adversarial. They just want to support kids. And I think we're realizing more and more that if we don't become advocates for our students and for our profession, then everyone else is determining the path ahead for us, and that puts us on the defensive.
Matt, what's been its impact? You're
No,
an administrator.
I'd say at this point right now minimal in that it's created some opportunity for dialogue, but we'll see how it, if it actually changes things in practice. And I think even if it does, the challenges we face aren't necessarily going to be addressed by this. And so I think when we talk about this panel, I think it was the implications of Vergara for urban education in particular. And so I just want to share two examples of how this of other issues we face that this will not necessarily address. So let's say it passes and we can. We administrators can do whatever we want. We have a teacher shortage in our district. We're trying to bring in people to our district. I'd much rather the energy we spent on how do we get good teachers in than worrying how do we get those few who are out. A second issue is it is a challenge for the administrators. They're put in a difficult situation, and so many times, and we're working with principals, we do need to step up and do those evaluations, right? Also, our principals, they're the ones who, when doing that, though, sometimes can be vilified in the school community for that, right? And which is challenging. But in my district, we have right now, which is very typical of urban education, we have, we're on our fourth superintendent in 5 years, right? I'm the third person in my position in 4 years. We have 31 schools in our district. 22 of them have principals who are in their first 3 years at school. So the lack of stability is something that we're dealing with. So then when you step back and think about this case and think about, do we need something like tenure? You asked that earlier. I gotta say, if I was a teacher and knew, okay, I'm going to have a 30-year career in urban education, because these are issues really in those urban districts, and I'm going to have 15 principals. Do I want to just be at the whim of some principal coming in who has a mandate for improvement and then is going to be gone in 2 years? So I think we can, I think it's given us an opportunity to have some better conversation. But in urban education, is it going to be the game changer? I don't see it as being the game changer in that way.
I want to get some questions in because I failed miserably in doing that last time. And Shannan's comment about acting on behalf of the profession and the students, that statement has prompted a line of questioning. What responsibility should teacher unions have as a group to consider students' interests? More importantly, when teacher interests conflict with student interests, who should be the voice of students at the bargaining or in the court of public opinion? Yeah, I guess that's going to you, but I'm going to ask Susan.
So here's what I'll say. That actually is a fascinating question because we're teachers and we went into the profession because we care about students. So,
but unions often
there's a mythology around the idea that unions don't care about students.
Well, no, that I don't think let me state it differently. That unions put the interest of teachers first, students second.
So here's what
and
I'll
I've
say.
seen that, certainly. I've spent a lot of time in Philadelphia where this, pretty hardcore union of worrying about salaries, seniority, et cetera, and all those with kids pushed to the back. So,
Okay,
I mean, that's the nature of this question.
So if you're asking me to speak on behalf of every union
No,
leader,
no,
I
just
can't
asking
do
your
that
opinion.
because just like there are bad anything, there are some bad union leaders. Okay. What I'll say is that our association, I'm in probably 60 to 70% of my time is spent on instructional issues. I meet with district leadership, I meet with teachers. What we're trying to do is figure out what are the issues that are impeding quality instruction, whether it's professional development, our evaluation system, implementation of Common Core, which takes on a whole host of issues. We're sitting down problem solving. How do we bring in teacher voice so that we can identify the problems? Because the further you are away from the classroom, the less you understand the complexities of what is happening and what are the barriers to learning. So that is, I would say, advocating for students in improved education is one of our basic tenets and one of the main things that I work on in my role.
Susan?
Well, I think one of the problems with this kind of question is that everyone has a view about teacher unions, but it's actually created by particular experiences. And so, what the San Juan Teachers Association does is fairly different from what the Philadelphia Teachers Federation does and how they behave. So it's hard. I always, have difficulty with someone that starts out unions and then, there's some judgment, good or bad. I mean, there's been, since Maggie Haley was the first president, there's been an ongoing discussion about whether what's good for teachers is good for students. And I think that, you can come at this in a lot of ways, but there's good research that says that good working conditions that provide environments where teachers can actually do the work that they entered teaching to do, not only retain teachers rather than having them become lawyers or whatever else you might be, but they also support student achievement and student growth. And so it's, if you look at the most adversarial, absurd struggle over whether an alcoholic teacher who doesn't get to school should be defended, and allowed to teach. I mean, that's, of course, we I think would all agree about that. But in fact, overall, in my state of Massachusetts, one of the most highly unionized and high-performing and well-funded in the nation, people generally would say the union has been a very constructive force in addressing issues of evaluation and such issues. Yep.
And there's no correlation between educational outcomes and the degree of unionization. I think we all know that.
Right.
Yeah,
but actually, if you just look at some of the states and all, it's
actually there's a negative correlation in some places. Yeah. So, do you think what's going on, the Vergara and this whole general mood, is deep down is an anti-union?
Yes.
And yes.
I think it's anti-union and anti-teacher and anti-public education.
Yeah.
All of them.
Wow.
And that's where I may be an administrator, but as you mentioned, I'm also a faculty here at Berkeley. So when you were speaking earlier about the conspiracy theories, I definitely see the movement to privatize education, to shift the society, the focus of how we're going to address society's challenges just to the schoolhouse is something I've seen over the last 20 years. And it's what No Child Left Behind set up, right? It set up the situation that we're going to shift the blame to schools that are failing schools, right? And I remember, about 10 years ago when I saw how the schools were being judged, right? That we were supposed to, in about 10 years, 100% of kids were going to be proficient and advanced or literate, right? Something no society has done. We were going to do it in 10 years. And my prediction was...
That's this year, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my prediction
That's
was
right.
when we got to the place where it was the more affluent communities that were used to being, were not considered failing, and would speak up if they were labeled failing, when it got to the point that they were judged failing, the system was going to change. And sure enough, we
have a race to the top and waivers,
right? Right. And so we no longer have No Child Left Behind. That's not an expectation. It's changed. So I am inclined to think that there's an agenda behind some of these, some of these policies and practices that are out there.
Judith mentioned my blog. I wrote this week about a man who runs nonprofit public charter schools in North Carolina and has managed in the last few years to take $15 million out of the system. People draw a distinction between for-profit charter schools and nonprofit charter schools, but I beginning to think it's a distinction without a difference. But you think it's anti-union and privatization? So
I think it was anti-union
you
because
think
of the way it was
public
played out.
education public education is in danger?
Yes.
You all do.
Not because of Vergara.
Right.
That's
No.
just one of
No.
many pieces, the kind of thing that you're describing.
Okay. So, question: teaching is the rare profession with no paid supervised apprenticeship period. How can this be changed?
With a paid supervised period.
By adding it.
I don't think any of you want to
Done.
try that. And the question, I'm going to change it slightly. Shannan, you're a career teacher. Have you ever regretted becoming a teacher? I'm sure some mornings, I'm sure. But
No, I love teaching. It was a hard decision to make to run for president of the association because it is a full-time release position. There are term limits. But I think, probably like most teachers, I think it's the most important profession in the world, that the opportunities that education provides are essential, and that public education, strong public education, is the cornerstone of our democracy. So I feel like it is my responsibility.
if you were 21 again, would you go into teaching?
Absolutely.
You would. Any of you? Would you? The question was, why should I go into teaching? Someone asking. What argument would you make that at this point, 2014, given race to the top and this test-based accountability and this sense that it's all on you to get high test scores, what argument would you make that a young person should, in fact, become a teacher?
For all the same reasons that we all became teachers. Mm-hmm. You love working with kids. It's exciting. You think believe you're doing valuable work. If it gets ugly, you move to another school district is really what you do. I mean, I think the question is, would Shannan have stayed in a district that didn't allow you to do the work you wanted to do? Or, I think, and I think those are some of the issues that came up in Vergara. That was being discussed with evidence from one of the most difficult and historically not well-managed school districts. And so you teach if you care about teaching, but you might teach somewhere else if your district, or particularly your school, doesn't allow you to do the work that you've committed your life to. If the kids could leave, they would, but the teachers do.
So I would just add to that absolutely you should go into teaching. We need people who are going to take a stand. So the time is now. It is not for wimps. But we need people who believe in students and in teachers and in public education. So now is the time. If you want to get in there and you want to stand up and say, this is what kids need and this is what we need for our profession, then we need you.
That, of course, is the argument that's being made on the right. This is the civil rights issue of our time. Join
Right.
Teach for America, et cetera.
For 2 years.
Yeah,
For 2
that's not
years
about
and
the
then do
But it
something
is.
profession.
It's the
That's
same
not
language.
the profession.
No,
It's the
it
same
is.
language.
It is.
It is
I
the same
understand.
language.
I understand.
And that's why it resonates with people, because you feel it here, right? It's a calling. This is part of our civic responsibility that hits you here. So that's why I'm sure young people sign up for Teach for America, because it feels like a civic responsibility. But the difference is they're not asking them to make it their profession. They're asking them to do that temporarily until they get to their profession. It's foundationally different.
Although I have to say, we, as I'm sure Berkeley and all other universities on this coast, get many Teach for America teachers after 2 years, 3 years. And, you know, it has had the effect of bringing into teaching some outstanding people who then, in fact, suddenly discover this is really what I love doing. So I think my concern is that they enter teaching, as do many charter school teachers, not knowing what they're doing. And I think that's really just, you know, inexcusable.
I followed 7 Teach for America teachers
yeah.
for a year in New Orleans, and it was after Katrina, and we devoted 1 year to following the 7, and it was fascinating that 2 of them hit it out of the park. They were just terrific teachers. 2 of them were terrible. One never got a chance because he had terrible leadership, and the other 2 were sort of middling. Of the 7, 2 of them left after 1 year. 1 is still there. 1 went to graduate school to get back so he could come back into teaching. And it was a wonderful tapestry. And then if you talk about the political stuff, I thought, you know, I make films and work for the NewsHour and stuff. This is a great film. And so I went to people, I have to go beg for money, and the reaction in fancy language was, is it all good? Because if it's not all good, we don't want to pay for it. Or is it all bad? Because it's not all bad, we don't want to pay for it. And that's, I mean, that polarization is, and the primary one, is it all good? But it is that polarization that can you, well, I want to get this question because it came for Susan, but I invite anyone else to weigh in.
Can I hand it off before?
You can have a lifeline. And that's, do you think that the equitable distribution of educational resources is possible given local control policies and funds? We have roughly 1,000 school districts in California, and about half of them have private foundations. The foundational spending is very low. I mean, it's a bizarre system. Can you imagine? There'd be a way?
I don't know exactly. I've read about the funding in California. I think that local control, when school districts are very dependent on the tax base, can never be equitable. I'm actually ultimately more hopeful about the possibility of equitable treatment within districts. So, in other words, it's the school-to-school differences that I think are
within
really...
a district?
Yeah.
But I would say though that the local control funding formula, you know, gives this notion of local control and definitely has increased funding for districts across the state. But when you're talking again about urban districts that serve predominantly poor students, it's you know, there's such a big gap that there still needs to be a lot more investment to make a difference. And this is again in terms of like the rhetoric of the arguments, right? That it's nice to say, you know, resources you can't throw money at the problem, right? And you know, yeah, and well, exactly. And there's evidence that it's really complex resources that matter. That it's not, you know, money alone isn't going to make the difference. But then, you know, ask districts like there's districts you know, near in the Silicon Valley that are spending $21,000 per student, okay, and we're spending about $8,500 per student in Hayward. So I'll say, if you really don't think it matters, give us half of what, half the difference even. We'll take it, and if they didn't care, there wouldn't be this difference. If it didn't matter, there wouldn't be this difference. And so, so we have increased funding somewhat, but the gap between the urban districts that are serving the kind of students who really need that support and the more affluent districts doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon in California.
I just finished a study on very early implementation of the local control funding formula. In fact, it just came out yesterday. And I have to admit, it doesn't say this in the study. That wouldn't be politic. I went into it a skeptic, thinking, oh my goodness, what makes us think that local communities are really going to be able to take this seriously? I came out of the study much more encouraged and enthusiastic. Districts are taking local control and additional funding and targeting for high-needs students very seriously. Now, we don't know yet whether it's going to work. We won't even know for a while yet what work means. But I was really impressed with the seriousness with which district officials were taking, how do we engage parents in these complex decisions? How do we think about, instead of just how much money we have, what do we need? And then how do we support what we need? Does California fund its schools well enough yet? Absolutely not.
Can you imagine that we could have a conversation either within a state or nationally about what we want for our kids? Instead of, there's such narrow conversations, fire bad teachers or get higher test scores. Yeah. Is there anybody, you see any leadership which would say, let's have this larger conversation?
It would require everyone assuming responsibility for our kids. Yeah. And I think at this point, we have my kids and your kids.
And other people's children.
I agree. Mm-hmm.
So you're not optimistic?
Not for that conversation. Not, no.
Or final, it's two questions actually. What do you think is going to happen with Vergara, the appeals court? What do you think will happen?
I have no crystal ball. I hope that the legislature takes the lower...
The challenge issued by the judge.
Yeah, and actually does something. I would like to believe that it will. On that, I'm not so encouraged.
Shannan?
I think the first panel covered it pretty well, that I think it was mostly based on rhetoric and not on the facts. And the statutes do not stop other ways of handling struggling teachers, tenure decisions. The statutes are not the problem. The problem are we have to sit down in our local communities and have conversations about what we think is best for the education of the students in our system.
Linda Darling-Hammond suggested that Jerry Brown might do that after the election. Do you have any reason to think he would?
If she says so, then I think it's probably going to happen.
What will happen if Marshall Tuck wins on Tuesday? I got 3 Californians here.
I have no idea. I honestly have no idea because although I like to think of myself as an informed voter, I'm still not yet clear on Marshall Tuck's platform. So I have no idea what...
He's in favor of reform.
Yeah, well, there you have it.
Also, one thing that has been helpful about the local control accountability plan and funding formula is it forces those local conversations. And I'll say in terms of where I feel like the superintendent of public instruction reaches my work in the district, it's hard to tell. They have limited control and not much, not around funding and around policy, and it goes through many different layers before it reaches me. That I'm not sure that the election would, how much it would impact my work at least in the near term.
So I think it will have very negative impacts, partly because of the work that California Department of Education is doing already around greatness by design, calling out collaboration is the right way forward, calling out what are some of the best practices around teacher evaluation and a myriad of other things. And the department has begun to move to support the development and growth of those best practices called out in greatness by design. So that's a plan. So I think it will be devastating to public education to move from thoughtful, deep work that took a little while to get started, but is moving to the rhetoric around no real solutions and still just talking about all these high-level things around Vergara.
Close by telling these folks how Vergara is an opportunity. I mean, this decision and what's coming, how could it be an opportunity?
I think we've done somewhat jokingly framed, administrators and teachers at odds. But I mean, we hear examples of where really it's the partnership that matters, and that's what we're trying to do in Hayward. And so where I think where we're on the same side to come up with solutions to the real problems we face, that might be the opportunity it gives us. But not because of the ruling itself, but more again because of the environment with which we work and the urgency that the ruling gives to come up with productive solutions to our issues.
I'm going to make that the last word. Thank you very much, and I hope we can move forward.